I decided to go on a solo camping trip in the late summer, wanting to escape the city for a few days. I packed my usual gear: a small backpack, a lightweight tent, sleeping bag, stove, water filter, and enough food for 4 days. The forest I chose was dense, remote, and not heavily trafficked. A mix of tall pines and scattered clearings with narrow, winding trails. I had studied the maps beforehand, knowing there were small creeks and a few abandoned logging roads that could help me navigate if I needed to. The plan was simple: hike deep into the woods, camp in quiet spots along the trail, and enjoy the solitude. The first 2 days were exactly as I expected. The forest was alive but calm. Birds moved through the canopy, small animals rustled in the underbrush, and the air smelled sharp with pine and wet soil. I hiked during the day, stopping occasionally to eat or rest near streams, watching the sunlight scatter in beams through the leaves. Nights were quiet. I pitched my tent in small clearings, cooked simple meals, and fell asleep to the sound of the wind through the trees. There was a rhythm to it that felt safe, predictable. On the third day, I moved deeper into the forest, following a trail that led to a small valley I hadn't seen on the map. It was narrow, flanked by steep ridges on either side, with a shallow creek running down the center. The ground was soft with moss and fallen leaves, and the slope of the land gave me a sense of isolation that was almost complete. I set up my tent in a small clearing at the base of the ridges, close enough to the creek to hear the water running, but far enough that the ground wasn't muddy. By evening, the forest had grown quiet in a way that felt unnatural. The usual sounds of birds and insects were faint, almost absent, and a cold breeze drifted down the valley, rustling dry leaves and carrying the scent of damp earth. I cooked a small dinner, washing the pots carefully in the creek, then climbed into my sleeping bag as the last light of the sun disappeared behind the ridges. Around midnight, I woke suddenly. At first, I couldn't tell why. The wind had picked up, whistling through the trees, and the forest sounded different in the darkness. Then I noticed it. A sound, soft but deliberate, like someone or something was walking through the underbrush just beyond my clearing. Not the uneven steps of a deer or the rustle of small animals, but heavy, slow, calculated steps. I froze, trying to convince myself it was just the wind moving dead branches, but the rhythm was too steady, too purposeful. I unzipped the tent quietly and peered outside. The moon had risen high, illuminating patches of the valley. I scanned the trees along the creek, careful not to make noise. Nothing moved. I told myself to stay calm. Maybe it was another hiker, but I hadn't seen anyone on the trail that day, and it was deep enough into the forest that I doubted anyone else had found the spot. The steps stopped suddenly, and the silence felt heavier. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it across the clearing. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the soft moss and fallen logs. But there was nothing. No person, no animal, nothing. Then I noticed something that made my stomach twist. Footprints in the damp soil near the edge of my clearing. They were human-sized, bare, and fresh. I traced them with the flashlight. They led down toward the creek and disappeared into the shadows. Panic started to creep in. I didn't have cell service, and the nearest ranger station was miles away. The idea of someone moving silently through the forest, unobserved, unsettled me. I packed up my tent quickly, trying to make as little noise as possible. Every snap of a branch underfoot felt like it would reveal me. I moved along the creek, keeping the ridges to my sides, hoping to find a trail I could follow out of the valley. The air was thick, humid with the smell of wet earth, and every sound, the rustle of leaves, the occasional plop of water from a distant branch, made me tense. I kept walking for hours, the forest seeming to stretch endlessly. At one point, I came across a small campsite I hadn't noticed in daylight. It was abandoned but had clearly been used recently. A small fire pit sat in the center with cold ashes and a few charred logs. Around it were remnants of a backpack, torn and scattered, and a few cans crushed underfoot. I checked the area carefully. There was no one in sight, but the air felt heavy with the presence of whoever had been here. I realized with a sinking feeling that the person might still be nearby, living off the grid, and perhaps had been watching me the whole time. The thought made my skin crawl. I moved faster, retracing my steps along faint game trails and small creek beds, careful to avoid making noise that might draw attention. The night passed slowly, my flashlight beam bouncing along trees, rocks, and underbrush, every shadow threatening to conceal someone or something. At times, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, only to find it was a tree branch or a fallen log. My heart pounded, my legs ached, and my stomach was tight with anxiety, but I forced myself onward. By the first hints of dawn, the forest began to lighten. Mist hovered over the creek, softening the shapes of the trees, and birds started to call tentatively. I emerged from the denser part of the valley onto a logging road I recognized from the map, exhausted but relieved. I walked steadily down the road, my pace slow enough to be cautious but fast enough to get closer to the ranger station. The forest behind me looked peaceful in the morning light, but I knew the calm was only a surface. I finally reached the ranger station mid-morning, mud-streaked and bleeding from minor scrapes on my hands and legs from moving through the underbrush. I explained the situation in detail, showing the footprints and describing the abandoned campsite. The rangers were calm but serious, noting that the area was known for people living off the grid, sometimes for extended periods. They explained that while most of these individuals were harmless, some could be unpredictable, especially if surprised by strangers. The realization hit me hard. I had spent a long night moving through the forest, not in the company of wildlife or storms, but in the presence of someone else's secret domain. After the report, I rested and drank water until I felt steady enough to hike out. The walk back along the marked trails was long and tiring, but the sunlight and open spaces gave me a sense of security I hadn't felt since entering the valley. I reflected on the experience as I walked, realizing that the most dangerous aspects of wilderness weren't always the obvious ones. Animals, storms, or accidents, but the unknown behaviors of other humans, hidden, observing, and capable of unpredictability. When I finally left the forest that day, the tension didn't immediately leave me. I kept thinking about the footprints, the abandoned campsite, the heavy steps I had heard in the dark. It had been a reminder of how fragile a sense of safety can be, and how quickly isolation can turn from peaceful to threatening. The forest had felt alive, and for that night it was alive with someone else, someone I had never seen but had known was there. The memory stayed with me for years, a constant caution when planning solo trips, a reminder that even in the wilderness, solitude is never guaranteed. I set out on my solo backpacking trip in September 2017, aiming to spend a week in the Olympic National Forest in Washington. I had done long solo hikes before, but this trip felt different. There was a quiet excitement in the air, a sense of being completely alone with the wilderness. The forest was dense in some areas, with moss hanging from trees like old, faded curtains, and sunlight filtered through the canopy in uneven streaks. I stuck to well-known trails the first few days, letting myself get used to the rhythm of walking alone for hours, the crunch of leaves and twigs under my boots, the occasional rustle of small animals disappearing into the underbrush. The first 3 nights passed without incident. I set up camp near small streams or in clearings that offered a view of the stars. Nights were calm. The only sounds were the wind through the trees, the distant calls of owls, and the occasional snap of a branch. My food was all lightweight, dehydrated meals and nuts, stored carefully in a bare canister away from my sleeping area. I had a small tent just big enough for me and my pack and a lightweight stove. Everything was simple, organized, and familiar. I liked the solitude, the way the forest made me feel small yet connected. By the 4th night, I had ventured further than planned. I found a small valley tucked between 2 ridges that looked perfect for pitching a tent. The ground was soft with fallen pine needles, and a slow, narrow creek ran along one side. It was shaded, quiet, and secluded, a spot that felt almost untouched. I set up my tent, stretched my sleeping bag, and cooked a small meal. The sun had already dipped behind the trees by the time I finished, leaving a dim twilight that made the forest feel heavier, more silent than during the day. I didn't think much of it, assuming the night would be calm like the others. I woke around 1 a.m., The kind of wake-up where your body is alert even before your mind fully registers what's happening. There was a strong, acrid smell in the air, something like rotting meat, sour and thick. At first, I thought maybe a dead animal had been dragged near the creek, but the smell was unusually strong, almost pungent enough to make my stomach turn. I slipped out of my sleeping bag and unzipped the tent, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The forest looked normal at first, quiet and still, but then I saw it. Between the trees at the edge of the valley, there was a shadow, a human-sized shadow. It moved slowly, deliberately, gliding just behind the trunks as if watching me. I froze for a long moment, heart thudding in my chest, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the moonlight or a tree branch swaying in the wind. But the shadow moved smoothly, without the randomness of nature. I forced myself to take a step forward, hoping to see more clearly. The smell grew stronger as I moved toward it. My instincts screamed at me to stay put, but my curiosity overrode my caution. I followed the odor, carefully picking my way through the underbrush, trying to keep the trees between me and the shadow. The smell was cloying now, almost unbearable, and then I noticed something I hadn't expected: a campsite. I had walked this area in daylight and thought it was empty, but there it was, a small, worn clearing with a fire pit that had been used recently. Ashes were cold, and the logs around it had been stripped and burned unevenly. On the ground, I saw remnants of a torn backpack, fabric shredded and scattered as if someone had left in a hurry. There were no footprints in the dirt I could clearly see, but the air was thick with the smell and a sense of human presence. I realized, with a creeping unease, that someone had been living here, or might still be living off the grid. The thought made my stomach tighten. This wasn't a campsite abandoned for a few days. It looked like someone had made this place home for a while. I imagined them moving silently through the trees, watching me. The idea made every hair on my body stand on end. I had read about off-the-grid survivalists and people who deliberately avoided contact, but this felt different, like someone who didn't want to be found, who might react unpredictably if they knew I was there. Panic edged in, subtle at first, then rising as I realized I had no idea who or what I might be dealing with. I backed away slowly from the small clearing, careful not to make a sound. My breathing felt loud in my own ears, but I forced myself to stay calm. I couldn't stay there. Packing up my tent immediately, I shoved my gear into the backpack and started walking, choosing a direction that would take me down the valley toward the trail I had planned to follow the next day. I stayed alert, every shadow in the dark feeling like a potential threat. The smell faded slightly as I moved, but the tension didn't. Every step through the undergrowth felt deliberate. I avoided snapping twigs or brushing against dry leaves. Night travel is hard in dense forest, but I knew the trails in the area well enough to navigate by memory. I followed the contours of the valley, keeping the creek to my left and moving downhill. The forest seemed different at night, darker, more oppressive. Even small sounds felt magnified. A distant owl, the drip of water from leaves, the scrape of a branch against another. I kept imagining glimpses of that shadow among the trees, forcing myself to remember there was no evidence it had followed me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I didn't stop until the first hints of dawn appeared through the treetops. The light gave me a false sense of relief. I could see now that the forest was empty, at least visually. I kept moving, heading for the nearest ranger station, which I knew was about 10 miles away if I took the lower ridges. By mid-morning, exhausted, mud-stained, and still on edge, I reached it. I collapsed on a bench outside, breathing heavily, every muscle aching from walking through the dark and uneven terrain. I was shaken in a way I hadn't expected, the kind of primal unease that makes your stomach churn long after the immediate danger has passed. I stayed at the ranger station until I could collect my thoughts and plan my route back. They seemed calm when I described what I had found: the torn backpack, the remnants of a fire, the smell. They explained that this part of the forest was known for people living off the grid, sometimes for weeks or months. Some were harmless, but others were unpredictable. The idea that someone could have been living in those woods, unseen, watching, and possibly reacting to any intrusion, made me realize how exposed I had been. It wasn't supernatural, it wasn't something I couldn't understand. It was just the reality of people choosing to live entirely apart from the rest of the world. But it had scared me far more than any bear or storm ever could. I left the forest that day, taking the longer, safer trail out, my pack feeling heavier than usual. Even as I hiked, I couldn't shake the mental image of the shadow slipping silently between the trees. I kept replaying the smell, the torn backpack, the small, abandoned fire. That day, and the night before, reminded me how fragile a sense of safety can be in the wilderness. People can hide anywhere, and sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't a creature or a storm. It's another human being, perfectly silent and unseen, living where you thought you were alone. I had been looking for a quiet place to camp for weeks, somewhere far from the weekend crowds and the noisy, overused trails. I drove along winding forest roads until I found a small pull-off next to an old logging road. The dirt track was barely visible, overgrown in places with brambles and young pines, but flat enough to pitch my tent. It felt isolated, untouched in a way that made me feel both peaceful and alert. I parked my car, carried my pack into a small clearing, and began setting up camp. The air smelled damp, earthy, like moss and wet bark. Snow had melted days ago, leaving the ground soft and spongy in places, and the small streams from the ridge above gurgled faintly, barely noticeable over the occasional rustle of branches in the wind. After setting up the tent and arranging my gear, I decided to explore. The logging road continued uphill, lined with trees so thick that light barely filtered through even in late afternoon. I followed it for a while, stepping over roots and fallen branches, until I came to a rusted gate blocking a narrower dirt path. The metal was corroded, pitted with years of exposure, and the padlock was weathered and welded in place. I ran my hand over it absent-mindedly. It didn't strike me as anything dangerous at the time, just another relic of an abandoned forest road. I took a few photos with my phone, curious but not particularly concerned, and turned back toward camp. The sun sank quickly behind the trees, and shadows lengthened until they merged into a uniform darkness. I lit a small fire and sat near it, enjoying the warmth and watching the smoke curl into the treetops. The forest seemed alive, but quiet in a way that felt contained, predictable. My attention wandered, listening to the creek nearby, the occasional bird settling in for the night, the whisper of wind through branches. It was peaceful, too peaceful, maybe. Around 11, I noticed a faint sound that didn't fit the calm. At first, I thought it was the gate I had seen earlier, rusting and shifting in the wind, making that long scraping sound as the hinges shifted. But the scraping persisted, low and deliberate, accompanied by a groaning noise that carried unevenly through the forest. It was faint at first, just enough to make me pause, but unmistakably human, or at least something heavy and deliberate like a person moving against metal. I stood up, shining my flashlight toward the gate and the logging road. The beam cut through the darkness, bouncing off bark and leaves, but revealed nothing. The wind had died down, the air was still, yet the sounds persisted. They weren't constant. They would start, stop, then resume in irregular intervals, scraping metal and low groaning, echoing faintly through the trees. My stomach tightened. Then I saw it, a shadow moving just outside the firelight, drifting between trees, staying at the edge of the clearing. It didn't rush, it didn't make a noise that I could identify beyond the scraping, but it moved deliberately, like someone surveying the area. My first instinct was to hide, but there was nowhere to hide without leaving the firelight. I felt exposed. Every muscle in my body tensed. I knew this wasn't a deer or a raccoon. Those sounds weren't made by animals. I grabbed my pack, leaving the fire to die down, and started down the logging road. My boots squelched in the damp dirt, echoing too loudly in the sudden, unnatural silence. Behind me, the scraping followed, moving in short bursts, stopping, then resuming. At times, it sounded as though something was dragging a heavy object across the road, or perhaps across the forest floor. I didn't look back, couldn't. Every instinct told me that if I turned my head, I might see more than I could handle. The road curved slightly, taking me into thicker forest. My flashlight beam bounced over moss-covered rocks, fallen branches, and young pines. The sound continued for several minutes, keeping pace with me, never getting closer but never leaving. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, it stopped. Silence fell, heavy and complete. I stood still, trying to catch my breath, listening to my own heartbeat. There was nothing, no rustling, no groaning, no dragging. Only the soft flow of the distant creek and the occasional snap of a branch under my own foot. I didn't stay long to investigate. I walked as fast as I could without tripping, keeping my flashlight focused on the road ahead. Every instinct screamed at me to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever had been following me. After a while, I reached a more traveled forest road, the kind that vehicles occasionally used. The sight of my car, dimly lit by a faint streetlight from the distance, felt like safety. I climbed in, locked the doors, and didn't turn off the headlights until I had driven several miles away. I never returned to that logging road. I didn't go back to retrieve my gear or investigate the gate. Weeks later, I mentioned it casually to a local when buying supplies, describing the gate and the noises. They gave me a sober look and said that people occasionally live illegally in those forests, setting up hidden camps in old logging areas, sometimes using metal gates or makeshift structures to mark their territory. They warned me that such people could be dangerous if confronted, especially at night, and that it was always best to avoid those areas entirely. Thinking back, it made sense. The scraping, the groaning, the shadow, it wasn't a ghost or a wild animal. It was a person or a group of people moving through the forest, perhaps disturbed by my presence. The irregularity of the noise, the deliberate dragging of something heavy, suggested someone trying to hide activity, not just wandering. My instincts to leave immediately were correct. My fear at the time felt irrational in one sense. I wasn't being hunted by something supernatural, but completely rational in another. The forest is vast, but not always empty. Since then, I've camped in forests closer to maintained trails, in areas where rangers are known to patrol and where other campers leave signs of life. I've been back to the region near that logging road in passing, but only from the main roads, never close enough to walk in. The memory of that night remains vivid. The smell of wet earth, the quiet before the scraping started, the dim firelight, the sense of being watched, and the sudden disappearance of the sound when I finally ran. I never tried to rationalize it too much beyond the explanation of illegal occupants. Some experiences don't need embellishment. They are scary because they are real, because someone or something was there and you were not supposed to know. That night taught me to respect the forests, not just for their beauty, but for the fact that they can hide people who are unpredictable and dangerous, who prefer to remain unseen until you stumble upon them. The gate remains in my mind, rusted and locked, a silent warning I didn't understand until it was too late. The memory of moving down the road in the dark, clutching my pack, with the sounds following and then stopping, still haunts me in small ways. Even now, years later, I can feel the tension in my body as I remember the shadows outside the firelight and the low groaning scraping across the metal. I left the forest that night with nothing but the clothes on my back, my pack, and a lingering awareness that isolation can be dangerous. The woods are not always empty. Sometimes someone else is there, and if they don't want you to be, they will make you leave one way or another. I never returned, and I never will. That logging road, the gate, and the sounds are a permanent part of my memory, a reminder that the wilderness doesn't always hold only peace and solitude. I had planned the trip for months, a solo backpacking journey into a remote part of the forest I had never explored. It was late August, the air already cooling at night, the days still warm but the mornings crisp. I packed my gear carefully: lightweight tent, sleeping bag rated for cool weather, stove, food, water filter, first aid, flashlight, and extra batteries. I wanted a few days of complete isolation, just myself, the forest, and the sound of the wind in the trees. I chose a region of forest where the trails were rough, barely maintained, and far from roads. My plan was to follow a small creek upstream, camp wherever I found a suitable clearing, and then loop back to the trailhead. The first 2 days went smoothly. The forest was alive but peaceful. Deer moved silently through the underbrush, squirrels chattered above me, and birds' calls echoed through the canopy. I kept careful track of my path, marking trees with small ribbon scraps so I could find my way back if needed. Nights were quiet. I pitched my tent in clearings near the creek, cooked simple meals, and listened to the water trickle while I drifted off to sleep. Everything was calm, predictable, and exactly what I had hoped for. On the third day, I decided to push further than I had originally planned, following the creek up a narrow, steep valley. The slope on either side was covered in thick underbrush, moss, and fallen logs, and the canopy above was so dense that sunlight barely reached the forest floor. I finally found a small clearing that was just big enough for my tent. The ground was soft, covered with pine needles, and slightly sloping toward the creek, which gurgled faintly nearby. I set up camp carefully, making sure the tent was anchored well and that my food was stored safely. The evening passed quietly. I cooked a small meal, cleaned my dishes in the creek, and crawled into my sleeping bag as darkness fell. Around midnight, I woke suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure why. The wind had picked up, whispering through the trees, and the forest sounded different. There was a faint, irregular noise, almost like someone stepping lightly over dry leaves and twigs. My heart began to race. Couldn't be an animal. I knew the forest enough to recognize the sound of small mammals, deer, or birds. This was heavier, deliberate, moving with purpose. I unzipped my tent slowly, careful not to make noise, and looked out. The moonlight illuminated the clearing in uneven patches. First, I didn't see anything. Then, movement at the edge of the clearing caught my eye, a shadow slipping between the trees. I froze, stomach tightening. I wasn't sure if it was a person or an animal, but the size and movement were unmistakably human. I strained my eyes, trying to get a better look, but the shadow stayed just beyond the trees, moving with slow, deliberate steps. I grabbed my flashlight, pointing it carefully toward the movement. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the forest floor, the moss, and the trunks of trees. I saw nothing, but then I noticed fresh footprints in the soft soil of the clearing, bare, human-sized, leading from the edge of the treeline toward my tent, then back toward the trees. Whoever it was, they had been there recently, and they had not meant to be seen. The realization made my chest tighten, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I packed up the tent as quietly and quickly as possible, keeping my flashlight low so it wouldn't catch attention. Every step I took toward the creek felt loud in my ears. The forest was silent except for the wind and the water. I followed the creek upstream, hoping it would lead me to a point where I could safely leave the valley. The night dragged on, every movement in the underbrush making me flinch. I convinced myself that the person might have left, but the prints suggested otherwise. I had no way to call for help. My phone had no service, and I was completely on my own. After an hour of careful walking, I stumbled across another small clearing. It was an abandoned campsite, though I hadn't noticed it during the day. A small fire pit sat cold and unused, but the area around it had signs of recent human presence. A torn backpack, some crushed cans, and a few pieces of worn clothing partially buried in the leaves. The smell of dampness and old smoke lingered in the air. My stomach turned. Whoever had been here before me could have been watching from the forest, living off the grid. It was the kind of isolation I had wanted, but it suddenly felt dangerous. I moved on, following a faint animal trail along the creek, careful to stay alert. Hours passed in the darkness. My flashlight illuminated rocks, fallen branches, and thick patches of underbrush, but I didn't see anyone. I imagined the shadow from earlier moving silently through the forest, observing without being seen. My body was tense, every muscle coiled. I stumbled over roots, slipped on wet rocks, and had to stop several times to catch my breath. My mind played tricks on me. Shapes became human figures, rustling leaves sounded like steps, and every snapped twig made me jump. Finally, just before dawn, the forest began to lighten. Mist hovered over the creek, softening the shapes of the trees and rocks. The sounds of birds and small animals returned gradually, and I allowed myself a slow, deep breath. I emerged from the dense underbrush onto a wider trail, a path I recognized from my maps. The daylight gave me a sense of safety I hadn't felt all night. I kept moving steadily toward the ranger station, exhausted but relieved. By mid-morning, I reached the station, covered in mud, scratched by branches, and shaking from tension and fatigue. I reported what I had seen: the footprints, the abandoned campsite, the heavy steps in the dark. The rangers explained that the forest was sometimes used by people living off the grid. Most were harmless, they said, but they could be unpredictable, especially if surprised by someone on their territory. I realized that all night I had been navigating through a human presence I could not see, in a space that was private to someone else. There had been no supernatural elements, no wild animal attacks, just the unsettling awareness that I was not alone in a place I thought was deserted. After resting, drinking water, and eating, I retraced my steps along the marked trail out of the forest. The forest felt normal again in the daylight, but I couldn't shake the memory of the footprints, the torn backpack, the careful, deliberate movements I had imagined in the darkness. That night had been a stark reminder of how quickly isolation can become frightening, and how the presence of another human, hidden, unpredictable, and silent, can make a familiar forest feel like a trap. Even weeks later, the memory stayed with me. I remembered the smell of damp earth, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot, and the unbroken silence of the forest except for the wind and the creek. I realized that the most dangerous and terrifying aspects of wilderness aren't always visible or dramatic. They can be subtle, quiet, and human. That trip taught me to respect the forest not only for its natural challenges, but also for the invisible presence of others who might share it in ways I could never anticipate. I returned home with relief, exhaustion, and a lingering sense of unease, forever cautious about wandering alone in remote areas again. I had been planning a solo camping trip for weeks. I wanted to get away from everything: phone, internet, people, and just spend a few days alone in the forest. I packed my gear carefully: a small tent, a sleeping bag rated for cool nights, a compact stove, dehydrated food, water filter, extra batteries, a first aid kit, and a flashlight. I studied the map of the area, a rugged section of forest where trails were barely maintained and human traffic was rare. I had backpacked alone before, but I had never gone this deep into a place so isolated. I told myself I wanted the solitude, but there was a part of me that knew deep down that being completely alone could be dangerous. I ignored that feeling as excitement. The first day of hiking was calm. The trail was rough, overgrown in some places but manageable. The forest was thick with pines and oaks, the sunlight filtering through the canopy in narrow streaks. I stopped occasionally by the creek that ran alongside the trail, drank cool water, and rested on rocks covered with moss. I noticed fresh deer tracks along the trail and a few piles of scat from smaller animals. Everything was normal, predictable, and peaceful. When I found a small clearing in the late afternoon, I set up my tent. The ground was soft, covered in pine needles, and the air smelled like wet soil and leaves. I cooked a simple meal, rinsed my dishes in the creek, and crawled into my sleeping bag as the forest grew dark. The first night passed without incident. I woke once to the sound of a branch cracking, but the moonlight revealed nothing, and the forest remained still. The second day, I hiked further, following the creek upstream. The trail became rougher, narrow and steep in places, and the forest thickened. The canopy blocked most of the sunlight, and the air became damp and cool. By mid-afternoon, I found a secluded clearing on a gentle slope above the creek, just wide enough for my tent. The area seemed untouched, as though no one had camped there in years. I set up my tent carefully, making sure the stakes were secure in the soft soil, and stored my food in my backpack, away from the sleeping area. Night fell quickly. The forest grew quieter than I expected. The wind rustled the leaves, but otherwise there was no sound. I could hear the creek, but it was faint and far enough away to be soothing rather than loud. Around midnight, I woke suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure why. The forest felt different in the darkness, heavier, almost watchful. Then I noticed it, a faint noise coming from the edge of the clearing. Something was moving slowly through the underbrush. My heart started racing. The sound wasn't random like an animal stepping on twigs. It was deliberate, rhythmic, like someone walking carefully over uneven ground. I unzipped my tent and carefully looked outside. The moonlight revealed nothing at first, just shadows among the trees. Then I caught movement, a figure, or what my mind interpreted as a figure, slipping between the trees. I froze. My stomach turned. The shadow was human-sized, moving with quiet purpose, just out of clear view. I forced myself to breathe slowly, trying not to panic. My instincts screamed at me to stay still, to remain hidden. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the treeline. The beam illuminated the forest floor, moss-covered logs, and tree trunks, but there was no one there. Only darkness and the faint ripple of moonlight on the leaves. Then I saw the footprints, bare, human-sized, pressed into the damp soil along the edge of my clearing. They were fresh. My heart pounded as I traced them with my eyes. They led from the forest toward my tent and back, almost as if someone had been circling me, watching from the shadows. My stomach tightened with dread. Whoever it was, they had been here recently, and they had not meant to be seen. I realized with a sinking feeling that I wasn't alone in this part of the forest at all. I packed up my tent quickly, making as little noise as possible. Each movement felt loud in the stillness. I took care not to shine the flashlight too far, fearing that any light might reveal my position. I followed the creek upstream, hoping to find a place where I could safely leave the valley. The forest seemed endless in the darkness. Every rustle, every snap of a twig made me flinch. Shapes that I would have ignored in the daylight appeared threatening now. Fallen logs became crouched figures. Shadows between the trees became watching eyes. Hours passed. I stumbled through the underbrush, slipping on moss-covered rocks and roots. The air grew colder as the night went on, damp mist forming above the creek. My legs ached, my hands were scratched by branches, and my chest burned with exhaustion and fear. At one point, I came across another clearing. It was clearly an abandoned campsite, though I hadn't seen it during the day. A small fire pit sat cold, and the area around it was littered with remnants of a torn backpack, crushed cans, and a few pieces of old clothing partially buried in leaves. The air smelled faintly of smoke and damp fabric. Whoever had been here before me had been living quietly, hidden. I couldn't help imagining them watching from the forest, unseen, and my skin crawled. I moved on, staying as quiet and low as possible. I followed faint animal trails and small ridges, trying to keep the creek in sight for navigation. Sleep was impossible, and fear had replaced any sense of peace I had felt earlier. My flashlight illuminated trees, rocks, and thick underbrush, but I saw no one. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound magnified. I convinced myself repeatedly that I was imagining the figure, but I couldn't shake the memory of the footprints. Finally, just before dawn, the forest lightened. Mist rose from the creek, softening the shapes of trees and rocks, and the sounds of birds and small animals began to return. I emerged onto a wider, faintly visible trail I recognized from the map. The sunlight gave me a sense of relief I hadn't felt all night. I moved steadily toward the ranger station, exhausted but aware that daylight made the forest safer. By mid-morning, I reached the ranger station, mud-streaked and scratched from the underbrush, heart still racing. I reported what I had seen: the footprints, the abandoned campsite, the deliberate steps in the dark. The rangers explained that this area was sometimes used by people living off the grid. Most were harmless, they said, but some could be unpredictable, especially if surprised by a stranger. I realized that all night, I had been navigating a human presence that I could not see, someone completely hidden and possibly observing me. After resting, eating, and drinking water, I hiked back along the marked trail out of the forest. The sunlight, open space, and familiar trail gave me a sense of safety that had been missing the night before. As I walked, I reflected on what had happened. The forest had seemed peaceful, quiet, and predictable in daylight, but at night, with the presence of another human hidden in the shadows, it had become tense, threatening, and unrelenting. I realized that the most terrifying aspects of wilderness weren't always storms or wild animals. They could be subtle, silent, and human. By the time I reached my car, I was exhausted physically and mentally. I had a mix of relief and lingering unease. The forest seemed normal in the daylight, but the memory of the footprints, the torn backpack, the heavy steps in the darkness, stayed with me. I knew I would never underestimate the presence of others in the wilderness again. Solitude had been my goal, but for one night, isolation had turned into a confrontation with the unknown in the form of another human. It was a stark reminder of how fragile a sense of safety can be, even in a place that feels remote, untouched, and wild. I had been planning the trip for weeks, mapping out a remote section of forest in the northern mountains. It wasn't particularly popular, which was exactly why I wanted to go. I wanted silence, the kind you only find far away from roads, towns, or other people. My car was packed the night before. A small tent, a sleeping bag, a portable stove, food for 3 days, extra water, a first aid kit, and a thick, heavy-duty flashlight. I left my phone in airplane mode, charging it only in case of real emergency. The drive up the mountain was long and winding. The trees grew thicker as the elevation increased, and the gravel road turned into dirt, pitted with small ruts from rain. I pulled over once to check the map and stretch my legs. The air was crisp and clean, smelling of pine and wet soil. A few small birds called, but otherwise there was nothing. No cars, no people, just the soft sound of wind brushing through branches. I felt a thrill of excitement. This is exactly what I wanted. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing near a bend in a shallow stream. It was perfect. Flat ground, dry soil, and enough space to pitch the tent. I parked the car at the edge of the clearing and started unloading my gear. Setting up the tent took a bit longer than expected because the ground was rocky in spots, but eventually it was secure. I arranged my sleeping bag inside, spread a tarp under it for extra insulation, and stacked my backpack against the side of the tent. After that, I walked down to the stream to fill my water bottles and rinse my hands. The water was cold, running clear over smooth stones, with the faint smell of moss and mud. I noticed a few animal tracks in the mud along the bank, probably deer or maybe a raccoon. Nothing alarming, just reminders that I wasn't completely alone in the forest. I took my time, moving slowly, enjoying the quiet. As evening came, I gathered firewood, careful to collect dry branches and twigs. The sun dipped behind the peaks, turning the sky orange and pink. I built a small fire pit, arranging stones around it, then lit it. The warmth was immediate, a comforting glow in the growing darkness. I cooked a simple meal, instant noodles with a few dehydrated vegetables, and ate while sitting on a flat rock near the fire. The shadows of the trees stretched long and thin. A breeze rustled the leaves, and for a moment, I felt completely isolated, which was both exhilarating and a little unnerving. Night fell faster than I expected. The stars came out in full, glittering against a black sky, and the forest became quieter, almost unnaturally so. I lay in my sleeping bag for a while, listening to the crackle of the fire, the faint rush of the stream, and the occasional hoot of an owl. That was when I first noticed the sound, something moving in the woods beyond the clearing. It wasn't the typical snap of branches from small animals. It was heavier, deliberate, slow steps circling the clearing. My stomach tightened. I told myself it was probably a deer or a large dog. But the sounds didn't stop. They moved around the perimeter, sometimes closer, sometimes farther, always keeping the same rhythm. I stayed as quiet as possible, watching the edge of the clearing. My flashlight was on, the beam scanning the trees, but I saw nothing. Every once in a while, a branch would snap, and I'd hold my breath. The firelight made the shadows dance in ways that played tricks on my eyes. Hours passed, and I couldn't sleep. I kept the fire alive, though the smoke began to sting my eyes. I rationed my water, tried to eat another small snack, and kept listening. The steps never stopped. They moved around the clearing, always staying just out of sight. I considered leaving, But I had driven too far down the mountain and would have to stumble back through the dark forest, which seemed even riskier. Around 3 a.m., the fire burned low, leaving me mostly in darkness. That's when I noticed something else. Small piles of disturbed leaves at the edge of the clearing, clearly not natural. I had seen animals move through the forest before, but these marks were different. They were scattered, deliberate, almost like someone had been testing the ground. I froze, heart hammering. My rational brain told me it was a bear, a large animal drawn to the smell of food. But bears don't usually circle a camp quietly, never breaking branches, never knocking anything over. I decided to wait until dawn. I stayed in the tent, flashlight off, breathing slowly. Every little noise made me tense. My mind replayed every possible scenario: bear, wild dog, even a human, though the idea seemed absurd. The forest is large. What are the odds someone else would be out here, and why would they circle my camp quietly? Daylight finally crept in around 6:30 a.m. I unzipped the tent slowly and scanned the clearing. The disturbed leaves were gone, and there were no footprints. The fire had burned down to embers. My food and gear were untouched. Everything looked normal, almost too normal. I debated whether to stay another night. The idea made my stomach churn, so I packed up immediately, taking extra care to make no noise. As I hiked back to the car, I noticed something I had missed the night before. A narrow set of tire tracks hidden in the dirt road, old but visible. They veered off into a side trail that led deeper into the forest. My mind connected dots I didn't want to think about. Maybe I wasn't the only one up here. Maybe someone had been watching the clearing for hours or even days. Maybe they had been camping, hiding, waiting, curious, or worse. I didn't stop to investigate. I kept walking, careful to stay alert. The climb down was longer and harder than I remembered, my muscles burning from tension and adrenaline. By the time I reached the main road, the sun was fully up. I drove straight back to the nearest town, stopped at a small diner for coffee, and told myself I'd only ever camp in well-populated areas from now on. Looking back, it still makes my skin crawl. I don't know what was circling my camp that night. I didn't see a face, I didn't hear a voice, I didn't see a shadow. But I know someone or something was there, testing me, staying just beyond reach. And somehow, I survived without any confrontation, without injury. It wasn't luck, not exactly. It was staying quiet, staying aware, and trusting my instincts. I've gone camping since, but I never go somewhere so isolated. I've learned that nature itself isn't always the scariest part of the wilderness. Sometimes, it's knowing there are other people out there, unseen, who might be watching, waiting, and moving in ways you can't predict. I keep a thicker knife in my pack now, a stronger flashlight, and I make sure someone always knows exactly where I am. That trip ended cleanly. I made it home, my car loaded with gear, my mind racing but intact. I told myself that was enough adventure for one lifetime, at least in that kind of isolation. The memory lingers, not as fear of the forest, but as awareness of what's out there beyond the trees. And that awareness has kept me safe ever since. I had been driving for hours, winding along a narrow mountain road that barely qualified as a path. The forest pressed close on either side, dark trunks rising straight and silent, their branches tangled high above like an uneven ceiling. I hadn't seen another car for nearly an hour, and the GPS signal had disappeared long before I reached the clearing I had marked on my map. The plan was simple: hike a few miles, find a spot to set up camp, and spend the night alone in the wilderness, away from any roads or signs of civilization. I liked the solitude, the way it made small noises in the forest feel enormous, like the world had shrunk down to just me and the trees. The trail was rough, littered with rocks and fallen branches, and I moved slowly, stepping carefully over uneven roots that tried to trip me. My backpack weighed heavily on my shoulders, loaded with water, food, a tent, a sleeping bag, and a first aid kit. Sweat ran down my neck despite the cool mountain air. Birds called out in bursts from high in the trees, but otherwise, there was silence, thick and absolute. As I climbed higher, the wind picked up, brushing cold against my skin and making the needles on the pine trees shiver. I found a small clearing just as the sun began to dip behind the peaks. The space was barely large enough for my tent, but it was flat and free of rocks, and a small stream ran nearby. I could hear the water over the soft rush of wind through the trees. Setting up the tent took longer than I expected. The ground was firmer than it looked, and the stakes refused to dig in easily. I had to hammer them with a rock I found, pressing against the canvas and straining my fingers until finally the tent held firm. Inside, I laid out my sleeping bag, smoothed the wrinkles, and organized my supplies in neat piles, the way I always did when I camped alone. Afterwards, I walked down to the stream to refill my water bottles and rinse the sweat from my hands. The water was icy and clear, slipping quickly between my fingers. I knelt on a smooth stone, watching small fish dart away from my shadow. Tracks in the mud nearby caught my attention. Deer, probably, or raccoons, their shapes clear in the damp earth. I studied them for a few moments, noting the way they meandered toward the forest, then backtracked, as though they were following a path I couldn't see. It made my skin crawl just a little. Not fear, exactly, but a sharp awareness that I wasn't the only creature moving through these woods. Night fell quickly, darker than I expected. I gathered dry wood for a fire, scanning the area for anything that looked too damp to burn. The sun left streaks of orange and purple across the sky, fading into a blackness that seemed to swallow the treetops. Once I had enough wood, I built a small fire in the center of the clearing, carefully arranging the stones I had collected into a rough circle. The flames caught immediately, sending sparks into the night, casting flickering shadows that danced across the trees. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, the smell of boiling water and rehydrated vegetables filling the clearing. The forest around me grew quieter as darkness settled. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made me tense. At first I thought it was just the wind or the occasional animal, but then I noticed a pattern. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate steps moving in the distance, circling the clearing. They were quiet but certain, not random, not like the quick scuttle of a small animal. Something was moving methodically just out of sight. My pulse quickened. I stayed still, scanning the edges of the clearing with the beam of my flashlight, but I saw nothing beyond the shadows. Hours passed. I tried to sleep in the tent, lying on my side with the flashlight at arm's reach, listening. The steps never stopped. Sometimes they seemed farther away, sometimes closer, as though whoever or whatever was moving around me knew I was watching. Leaves shifted in ways they shouldn't, branches bent and snapped as though tested by unseen hands. I thought about leaving, but the idea of moving through the dark forest alone seemed worse than waiting. I kept the fire burning low, smoke curling up into the night, and tried to make myself small, invisible. By the time the first light of dawn crept over the peaks, I was exhausted. The steps had stopped hours before, but the feeling of being observed lingered. I unzipped the tent slowly, scanning the clearing. Nothing had moved, nothing had been touched. The piles of firewood were intact, my backpack in the same place I had set it. The disturbed leaves from the night before were flattened again by dew, leaving no trace. It was unnerving how normal everything looked after hours of tension. I decided to pack up immediately. My hands shook slightly as I folded the tent, rolled the sleeping bag, and stuffed everything back into my pack. I kept my eyes on the edges of the clearing, my flashlight cutting through the faint mist rising from the stream. The forest seemed empty now, quiet in a way that felt deliberate, like it was holding its breath. As I hiked back down the trail to the car, I noticed tire tracks in the dirt road I had missed on the way in. They were old, partially washed out by rain, but they branched off into a narrow path that led deeper into the woods. My stomach sank. I realized the steps I had heard weren't random. Someone had been moving quietly around the clearing, watching. I didn't know who or why, but I knew I didn't want to find out. I kept moving, careful with every step, watching for anything out of place. My muscles ached from tension and the uneven trail, but I pushed on. The sun rose higher, brightening the trees and warming my shoulders, and gradually the forest lost its menacing weight. When I reached the main road, I felt a wave of relief I hadn't expected. I stopped at the first gas station I came to, drank coffee, and let the heat sink into my chest. The trip taught me more than I anticipated. The wilderness itself wasn't the danger. It was other people, unseen, patient, unpredictable. Awareness and caution were as necessary as any equipment. I keep that lesson in mind every time I plan a trip now. I check the roads, scout the area online, and always leave a detailed plan with someone I trust. The mountains are still beautiful, still quiet and compelling, but I've learned to respect that the quiet can hide more than I want to find. I got home safely. Nothing was broken, nothing stolen. No confrontation had occurred. The story could have ended much worse, but the clear takeaway was simple. Vigilance, patience, and intuition saved me. I never returned to that trail, and I never will, but the memory remains vivid. A reminder that the forest isn't just about isolation and serenity. Sometimes, it's about what you don't see, what's just beyond the edge of the clearing, moving carefully, waiting. And knowing that, I still go camping, but differently, smarter, safer, and always aware. I had been planning the trip for weeks. The ridge I chose wasn't on any official map, just a line on a topo that suggested a passable route with a decent view. Spring was just starting to reach this elevation. The snow was melting unevenly, leaving patches of white against dark soil, and small creeks ran lazily down the slope. The air was crisp, the kind that smells of wet pine and melting snow, and it carried a quiet that almost made me feel like I was the only person left in the world. I set up my camp on a small, flat shelf just below the crest. The ground was firm enough to drive stakes into, though some of the soil was damp and soft, which I noted but didn't worry about. I pitched my tent, laid out my gear, and gathered enough firewood to last the night. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the ridge, and the mountain behind me threw a dark silhouette that made the valley below look even emptier. I had a small stove for cooking, and I boiled some water for instant soup, trying to enjoy the silence. By late afternoon, the sun had dropped behind the ridge, and the world became a mix of deep shadows and the fading orange glow that settled on the snow. Night fell fast. I watched it slowly creep over the ridge, the snow reflecting what little light remained, giving the world a strange, pale glow. Around midnight, I woke to a sound. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. Soft scraping, faint but deliberate, like metal or wood against packed dirt. I froze, listening, trying to place it. Then it came again. A scraping, rhythmic, deliberate, and unmistakable. Shovels. I didn't know who or what would be digging at this hour. My mind raced through possibilities. A hunting party preparing traps, some maintenance crew from a nearby access road, maybe even a local checking trails. It seemed plausible. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed down the ridge toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, bouncing off the wet snow and the trunks of pines, but I found nothing. The ground was undisturbed except for melting snow and the faint tracks of animals, maybe deer. I thought I might have been imagining it, a trick of the wind through the trees. Then it came again. A scrape, a grunt, something heavy being dragged across the soil. The sound wasn't close enough to identify precisely where it was, but it was definitely moving. I stayed down there for nearly an hour, walking in circles, shining the light into every shadow, checking the small depressions along the creek banks. Nothing. No person, no footprints beyond the usual animals, no equipment. I couldn't see anything. The sound, though, kept coming and going, following no predictable pattern. Sometimes far enough away that I thought it had stopped. Sometimes close enough that I could hear the soil shifting and something heavy moving, dragging. I could hear faint breathing at times, uneven, like someone was crouched low, moving slowly, deliberately. The sound would stop abruptly, only to resume elsewhere in a few minutes. It was the kind of irregular pattern that made it impossible to anticipate or locate. I went back to my tent and tried to sleep, but every few minutes I would wake, straining to hear over the wind in the trees, the melting snow dripping from branches. Each time I closed my eyes, I could hear the scraping again. It was coming from multiple directions, though I couldn't be sure if it really was, or if my mind was trying to place it in the three-dimensional space around me. At one point, I could swear I heard something heavy hitting the soil not far from my tent, then dragged slightly downhill. I didn't move. I didn't dare. I just lay there, trying to convince myself it was a deer or some kind of animal. By the early hours of morning, the air had shifted. A faint mist rose from the melting snow and the small creeks, coating the trees with dew and softening the world into a gray haze. The scraping had slowed, but not stopped. I heard it move closer, pause, then retreat, leaving small, wet squelches in the soft soil. My heart was racing. I realized I had no way of knowing what I was dealing with, and that realization terrified me more than anything else. As dawn broke, I saw the marks. At first, I thought it was animal tracks, but the grooves in the snow were too large, too irregular. They were depressions dug into the soil, then dragged through the forest. Someone or something had dug into the ground and dragged something heavy through the area, leaving long grooves in the wet soil and slush. I could see them extending from the ridge, curving through the trees, disappearing into the denser part of the forest below. The soil was churned, partially frozen in some places, soft in others, with deep marks as if a heavy body or object had been pulled along. It was too deliberate to be a natural occurrence, too big to be an animal. I didn't wait. I didn't pack anything except what I could grab quickly. My tent, my sleeping bag, my stove, all of it stayed behind. The ridge that had seemed so peaceful and scenic the day before had become a trap, a place where I had no control, no way of knowing what I had disturbed or what might still be moving nearby. I hiked down the slope as quickly as I could, my boots squelching in the wet snow, my pack light, my pulse hammering in my ears. Every sound made me jump, branches snapping, the creek gurgling, rocks shifting underfoot. I didn't look back. The path to the road was longer than I remembered. Each step felt heavy, my legs sore from the uneven terrain and the tension in my body. By the time I reached the gravel road that led back to civilization, the first cars were starting to pass. The ordinary world, with its traffic and distant voices, felt surreal after the hours I had spent on that ridge. My hands were shaking, my mind replaying the scraping and dragging noises over and over. I reported nothing to anyone. There was no one to report it to anyway. Could have been hunters, a lost logging crew, someone disposing of an animal carcass. Whatever it wasn't something I wanted to investigate further. I realized that some places in the wilderness are not meant to be explored at night, not meant to be understood fully, and some sounds are not meant to be explained. Weeks later, I returned home and packed the memory away. I never went back to that ridge, never attempted to retrieve my gear, never even told anyone the exact location. The marks in the snow and the dragged grooves were burned into my mind. I still remember the soft scrape of metal or wood on soil, the faint breathing in the dark, the dragging sounds that no one else would ever have heard. It was a clear lesson. Wilderness doesn't have to be haunted to be terrifying. Sometimes, the fear comes from not knowing what's out there, and from the realization that even a place that looks peaceful can hide something deliberate, heavy, and unstoppable. That ridge is gone from my memory only in name. The sound of shovels scraping and heavy objects being dragged will never leave me. And every time I hear the faint, irregular scrape of dirt underfoot or the gurgle of a forest creek at night, my mind goes back there, to that ridge, to the snow, to the grooves that told me I had been close to something that should never be disturbed. I never returned, and I never will.